Greetings, everyone, and welcome to the Actually Living podcast. Today, I'm honored and grateful to have a very special guest, someone very formative to my development in the practice of medicine and how I think and approach the world at large. Today, I'm pleased to introduce you to Dr. Paul Kalnins, naturopathic physician, practitioner of Chinese medicine, and former professor of naturopathic medicine in Portland, Oregon. You can find Dr. Kalnins at his website, drpkalnins.com, and begin a great learning journey over at his YouTube channel, youtube.com/at Dr. P. Kalnins. And please go ahead and subscribe over there. I'll put all of this information in the description box below for those that want to go learn some more, read some more, watch some more. But all the links will be down below there. And with that, I would like to warmly welcome and thank Dr. Kalnins for being here today. Dr. Kalnins, it's good to see you and welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tommy. Thanks for that introduction. It's nice to see you again and nice to be here.
Thank you. I'd like to just start for the audience, for those who may not know of you, I'd like to start with a little bit about how you got involved with naturopathic medicine, your specific vocation, what drew you to all this, kind of just a little background for the audience on your upbringing and how you got to where you are today.
Sure. Yeah. So I actually went through naturopathic medical school back starting in 1993 to 1998. I also did a master's in Chinese medicine, so it took 5 years to do that combined program, and then did a residency after in an outpatient clinic for a couple of years. So that was quite a while ago. The profession has really changed since then. What kind of led me up to that is my family has a background in medicine. My father was a surgeon, and his father was a family doctor, trained in Eastern Europe, who then came over after World War II to the United States. So I had sort of grown up in a very medical environment. Although I was fascinated with medicine, I began to sort of think more deeply about kind of the conceptual foundations that we use in medicine, how we think about the body, what healing means, and so forth. So I actually, as an undergrad, studied physics and math, wanting to kind of get to more fundamental basis of things, and began to look at what we now call complex systems biology, and even quantum biology, which is that's a big word we'd have to sort of explain further. That's actually become an academic field in a very narrow sense, not so much what people are talking about in the public. But the idea that there are maybe some unique novel mechanisms for how the body maintains itself, maintains order, and so forth, how organs regenerate, these different things. So that led me to not go to a conventional medical route, but rather to go down the naturopathic route. And since then, I graduated, practiced for many years, and then went back and taught for almost 20 years at my alma mater in Portland here. The National University of Natural Medicine, is this now called. And then a couple of years ago, I basically left there and started a private practice online, but then have been doing a postdoctoral fellowship now in bioinformatics and computational biomedicine through the NIH here at the medical school, OHSU in Portland. So that's kind of taking me down a different road and helping me think a little bit more deeply about kind of the science behind medicine and how we can merge maybe more non-traditional ideas into conventional medical thinking. So it's sort of a brief synopsis of kind of where I come from and sort of my idea base.
Yeah, thank you so much. And there's many avenues we could take with all that you brought up in that, but I thought we'd start with sort of how I was first introduced to you and how this sort of changed my thought process. And we'll get into this other concept later, and you have videos on this, and that is sort of modes or ways of knowing. But first, I just wanted to briefly share the screen here because I wanted to share, like you'd mentioned, previously a professor at National University of Natural Medicine. And for those who aren't aware, listening to the show and listening to some of my videos, that's where I went to school. I call it the once prestigious medical school in the US. And that's a whole nother story. But real quick, I want to share the screen because the very first class that I had at NUNM, when I originally started in the naturopathic program and was doing the dual degree in Chinese medicine, Um, we had a course entitled Introduction to Medical Systems, which you taught at that time. And the first day of class, I did an introductory PowerPoint. And there was an image that stuck out from that PowerPoint, and it's stuck with me ever since. I have it here. I'm going to show it in just a moment for the listeners that are watching this on YouTube and on the video. And there were all these sort of thoughts, feelings, inner processes going on throughout all of my schooling and background as I got to NUNM. And this picture actually sort of summarized for the first time in a visual way what my thought process was as I was studying all these so-called sciences and gathering all this data. So I'm going to share it now. I believe it is from the fabric anatomy, the fabric of the body. Can you tell us a little bit about this image? Because this really stuck with me.
Yeah, this is actually from a famous anatomist, Vesalius,
Yes.
during the Renaissance. He was one of the first to really create accurate anatomical drawings, depictions, paintings of the body, and where the bones were depicted, and then other of his images include, muscles and nerves and so forth. And of course, we had Da Vinci at the same time doing something very similar. But this was really, what I think, if I remember back to that lecture, it's
Yeah.
been many, many years, but what I was trying to point out is that during the Renaissance, there was a real shift in Western thinking about the human body, but about nature in general. Before that time, there was a lot of belief in what we might call spirits and the spirit world, in what we might refer to as supersensory forces and activities. And gradually, with the Renaissance, people began to look more at the physical as the root of everything. So instead of looking at higher realms, God, gods, whatever you might have it, we began to look at matter in the material realm as the source of, the originator of everything that we see around us. And so there was a lot more attention paid to matter. In fact, up until that time, some have argued that really people did not perceive in three dimensions like we just take for granted today. They were really perceiving more two-dimensionally. Versus in the Renaissance, we now see perspective drawing, and we see that emphasis on that third dimension. So the material physical realm really became the primary starting point for the sciences, and then gradually for medicine and so forth. So I think Vesalius was at that crucial time where we began to see the body not as a system of processes or activities flowing in time, which is what a lot of traditional medicines emphasized, but rather, we look now at the material, the physical, and we just start describing things. And that's, of course, the rite of passage in medical school today. The first class you take is the gross anatomy lab, where you basically spend a whole term dissecting cadavers. We might argue the ancients would have said this is kind of silly because in a way, the life processes and even higher soul, psychic processes and whatnot are no longer active in the corpse. What we're seeing is just decay, and we preserve it, of course, but we're seeing the remnants of life, not life itself. And so Western thought has really focused on this sort of, we might say, the corpse aspect of nature. We start to look at, the parts of nature that have been enlivened at one time, but now have fallen into death. And if we look at how modern medical research proceeds, it's always killing things. It's to destroy them. Basically, we have to cut things up. We have to chop cells up and take out their pieces, and we extract the DNA, and then we chop that up even further. And so we're constantly dissecting and analyzing. But it's sort of like the life then sort of falls out, it's gone, and then we're just left with the image of life, the corpse of life. And so I thought this image really depicted that quite well.
Yeah, absolutely. And for our audio listeners, we're looking at a skeleton here, perhaps in the thinking posture, observing another skeletal skull. And what really stuck out for me when I first saw this image, and Dr. Counter just mentioned this, was, this was almost like death looking at death. And I just always had remembered from my anatomy labs and bio labs and looking at slides, Like you said, it was always the dissection of something and then the killing and sort of the freezing in time of something. And we were even talking before the show about biorhythms, and we can even equate that to the modern sort of reductionistic data collection focus within medicine, where it's looking at really just a snapshot of one point in time. And so this image here just harkens to that in the sense that we're looking at something void of the life process. And even in the term biology, we're referring bio to the life, and in the practice of medicine, especially in the natural medicines, perhaps more holistically minded, we're always looking at rhythms and hopefully interacting with life rather than some sort of stagnant death process. But I think this segues us into a good topic to start with, because this will start to distinguish between sort of two methods that are very distinct and very different to the approach of medicine today, and it's sort of encroaching its way into even the natural medicine. But let's start a little bit about, you talk a lot about ways of knowing. You've got a lot of great information on your YouTube channel about that, but could you give us a little bit of a discussion around ways of knowing? And I want to start just briefly paraphrasing you from one of your YouTube videos. I think this will be a good lead up to that. And that's, you've said, when people say that something is scientific, they are saying more than just that something has been tested through the scientific method. Really, they're saying if something doesn't align with the belief system, the ontology of modern science, then it is somehow unscientific. For the listeners, this is a really important concept, especially nowadays. I even saw this throughout my schooling, which was supposedly natural medicine. Could you talk a little bit about that, Dr. Kalnins?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important topic because
Yeah.
that it's, I think a lot of people are unconscious about some of the terms they use, like saying something is scientific, or this, we're going to use science to support this. You know, science really, so what we call science has two aspects. One is the aspect most people I think are familiar with, which is, you know, the idea of testing through experiments. So we form hypotheses, then we make an experiment, we test it, we gather data, and then we see if we confirm that hypothesis or not. And then we're constantly adapting our hypotheses to that. So we could argue science never finds truth. It really can falsify things, but it can never prove anything. It could just maybe generate new hypotheses. So that's part of what we call the scientific method. And I think everyone is familiar with that aspect of science. And I don't think anyone would argue against that. That's important. Now, if we analyze that a little bit more deeply, we see, well, you know, that's true, but science also in testing things is saying, well, only certain things are important to test and other things are not. So for example, what we call quantitative data, mass, you know, matter, things we can measure that are mathematically descriptable, you know, that's what we kind of give priority to. And then things like your feeling, maybe a subjective impression of something, we tend to, you know, say, well, that's just, you know, that's all in your head. That's not universal, so that shouldn't be part of science. And that actually arose out of philosophers like John Locke and whatnot, who in the 1700s separated basically, you know, objective from subjective thinking. And we've kind of gone down that road ever since. I'll come back to that because there's some interesting modern developments. But so that's one aspect, is the scientific method. We usually focus on quantitative measurable things. But beyond that, there is what we might call the fundamental belief system, or as you mentioned, ontology of modern science, which is basically formed on 3 to 4 different pillars. We'd say the first pillar is materialism or physicalism, that what's real is what can be measured as matter or physical energy, electromagnetic or gravity or whatnot. So that counts as real. Things like vital forces, soul, spirit, those are not real. That's maybe what we call an epiphenomena of matter. It arises from matter, and that's the current viewpoint, for example, in neuroscience, that your feelings, your thoughts arise from the activity of your neurons, your actual nerve cells. But what's real is the nerve cells. And then the other stuff is fluff that kind of comes off of them. And so we should really focus on the nerve cells and how they work and how they're connected. So that's the physicalism. The other part is reductionism, which is, well, to understand that whole, we can go in and look at the pieces, and we can analyze the genes and all the different pieces of your nerve cells, all the neurotransmitters and how they fit together, and create elaborate networks and figure that out. And so that's reductionism. So we can get really small. And I'm currently in the program I'm in, people are looking at little things like where a protein such as ubiquinone attaches to this or that, which amino acid residues contain binding sites for different things. And so it's really getting to that little minutia pieces. Now, we can back up and say, well, how's that going to help any of us? And that's a good question. But that's kind of where reductionism goes. And it's, we if you go to if you are in medical research, you look at where a lot of the funding for medicine goes, it's all on that little level. So we can target things like receptors for different what are called cytokines, which are immune neurochemicals, and we can target them very precisely now, and we can block inflammation very effectively. These drugs are quite expensive, but they're very effective at what they do. And then we have, of course, everyone's talking about Ozempic and Wegovy and these different drugs, which also work by essentially binding to a specific receptor in the body that works with your blood sugar and everything else. So it works with insulin. So we can basically target things very precisely, and that's the outcome of reductionism. And then the third aspect of the belief system of modern science is mechanism, that the mechanisms we study in the physical world, for example, how a car engine fits together and how that works, or a clock fits together and that works. That's just how the body works as well. So we can use those same mechanisms to understand how a drug interacts with a receptor, or how your genes work in different things. So we're taking insights from the physical world, especially the inorganic, dead world, and applying it to a living system. And we think that we can do that. So that's a fundamental belief also of modern medicine. So those three really are the foundations of modern science, that we basically start, with the matter and physical energies, and then we move into, we look at the pieces, and then we fit those pieces together with known physical mechanisms. And that's how modern medicine works. That's how research in medicine works. That's how science is working. But we're hitting barriers. And I think that's where, we have to start looking at, okay, well, maybe we don't have to abandon science, but maybe we need to expand the conceptual basis of science and medicine to really understand that, and that we can get into that a little bit more. But so that's when people say this is something as scientific, they really are meaning it's material. It's really the philosophy of materialism. It says if you can't justify it in a material sense, or like I said, physical energies, a physicalist sense, then basically it's not real. And so that's kind of the implicit thing that people say when they talking about science. And that really is where science now becomes more of a religion, right, and not so much what it should be, which is a way of testing hypotheses, and doing experiments. And that religion, some have referred to as scientism. So you're just sort of saying, well, if it's not scientific, you're out of the church of science. And this has unfortunately become very politicized, and we often associate now the left and liberalism with the materialist scientific perspective, and then the right tends to be more with, more of maybe non-materialistic, looking at other things, spiritual processes and different things like that. So we have, unfortunately, this divide in this country based on that kind of political, and that happened with the pandemic as well. We can certainly get into that, but it's certainly, has created a rift, and it's creating a larger rift. My whole agenda is to say we shouldn't abandon science, but we do need to, I think, expand the conceptual basis of science to include the idea maybe there are supersensory activities in the world. Maybe we need to develop methods and techniques to study those. And that gets into what you're talking about is modes of consciousness. That with the intellect, we can study the physical world very well, kind of like that skeleton contemplating the skull. That's the intellectual framework. With the intellect, we really have to cut things apart. We have to put them into pieces, and then we connect them. And so again, that's all the kind of modern thinking. There are other ways of knowing, for example, looking at how we observe processes in time. And that is more using pictures that flow. And these ideas are not unique to me. They actually come from the school of phenomenology in Western philosophy. Rudolf Steiner was an Austrian philosopher who really outlined these modes of knowing, and that was sort of the basis of his anthroposophy and anthroposophic movement. But basically, the intellect is only one mode that we have available to us. But there are other modes all the way up to the intuitive that can give us more insight into more subtle phenomena in nature.
Right, right. Thank you for that. And that really is a whole, I think you've done it in a maybe perhaps a three-part series on your YouTube. This is a deep concept. And you really hit on kind of the next piece of the outline, and that was the term scientism. That's become quite of a buzzword of these last few years as we saw kind of the outfalling of the COVID pandemic, and we've sort of got to peek behind the curtain even more so. And many people have called sort of the idea of scientism as the new religion for atheists. So atheists are in fact perhaps practicing a religion, and that's scientism. And so, when I think about going through all this schooling, you've gone through plenty of schooling as well. I just always remember sitting in class and let's say, for instance, we're learning about the supposed layers to the Earth, and I just saw an image of it today as I was reading. It's that maybe the average surface temperature of our Earth, will say, is 53 degrees Fahrenheit, and then you have the mantle piece, which all of a sudden becomes over 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit, and you get to the core of the Earth. And I was always wondering as a going through these classes as a kid, and even still nowadays, as I approach different modes of thinking as an exercise to something like that, there doesn't seem to be so much logic and doesn't seem to be so much of a method, in this case, the scientific method, to things like this where they're throwing out these big numbers and they can't exactly tell you how in the world they kind of got that internal temperature of the earth. They oftentimes leave out that this is still very much a hypothesis. Apparently, the deepest hole ever dug from the surface of the earth is about 7 miles in. And so, does anything come up for you there when it comes to, all of us going through this educational system? And we're just sort of told things and almost in a sense of brainwashing, just, okay, just memorize this information. Here you go. And there's not really any instruction as to how to think. And this might lead us in as well. And you were the first to bring him up. I was going to see how long it would take to bring up Steiner in our conversation. This might lead into spiritual science. That's another topic we could get into and discuss. But first, let's perhaps dive a little deeper into this sort of approach to how we're taught how to think, or really taught how not to think in modern education.
Yeah, what's interesting is that science was developed, were developed after the Renaissance, really as a way of replacing superstition. There were a lot of beliefs and people were doing things that weren't necessarily grounded in any sort of reality. And they were based more on tradition and authority of the church and whatnot. So science sort of developed as a way of saying, hey, we should really look at this, and can we use our physical observations and so forth to do that. And I think it really helped humanity evolve to the next level. We had to separate from the truth from fiction, and that was a great way of doing that. I think now, unfortunately, what's happened is that, just as you say, it's most of the so-called facts of science that are learned you read in textbooks, and you're of course not given the original experiments they came from and the original data. And so we just memorize things. And what we now know, that a lot of the things that we are spouting, even in science, as truth, soon become outdated. And we realize, well, that was not quite correct. So a good example of that is, a lot of people learn about in biology the cell. And when you talk about living cells, or when you learn about them in your textbook, you see this picture of the cell with its nucleus and all the little organelles and the gene, the chromosomes in the middle, the nucleus and the DNA. And you have all these nice colored pictures, and then you might see animations of proteins moving around and so forth. But many who are really, deeply involved in research in cell biology and whatnot, like that's not the cell at all. It's this fluid, this sort of semi gelatinous fluid more in a colloid state. There are various very interesting electrical phenomena going in the cell. These organelles are constantly morphing and moving. So to kind of think of it as a static machine with parts interacting is really incorrect. And that's created a lot of damage in how we understand that. And even things like genetics, we learn basic things like Punnett squares and these different things in biology class. We talk about Gregor Mendel, his yellow peas and green peas, and how we can start to see how the laws of inheritance work. Well, it's well known now that Mendel had actually designed very specific hybrids, so he was getting results that were not typical. And that's the case with almost any gene now. We realize even things like eye color, it's not as clear as one single gene being passed down. It's multiple genes. And with most chronic illnesses, there are hundreds of genes involved. Yet we continue with this mentality, well, we got to find that gene and we'll fix it somehow. We'll use CRISPR or something to fix it. And in very rare cases, there are genetic disorders where you can do that. But for the vast majority of illnesses, that's not the case. So this is where we start to teach the way we teach science and our images and pictures. That can influence the researchers down the road and how they think about it. That influences how doctors think about the body. So my whole interest has been, well, how do we change that so that, yes, we don't throw that away. That's an important piece of things, but there's a lot more to it, a lot more complexity to the system that we currently are acknowledging.
Right. And that gets us into with the sort of introduction in your discussion on cell theory there, that gets us into perfectly the sort of idea, because this is what a lot of reductionistic pathogenic models of so-called allopathic or modern medicine, and even now into the so-called natural medicines, is rooted in this idea of sort of pathogenic versus salutogenic. And you were the first to introduce me to this term salutogenic, and farther so salutogenic terrain approach is how you describe your approach. And I would say once I understood the terminology and what salutogenesis had meant, we're always kind of looking to help farther define and identify, what is it that we're actually doing here. I think natural medicine for years has had an identity crisis. And it's always, especially in naturopathic medicine, with the idea of the therapeutic order and and always coming up with new definitions of what naturopathy is. Could you talk a little bit about this difference between, I think most people will understand pathogenic, but salutogenesis, certainly a new term for me when I first heard it from you. Could you talk a little bit about that? Because that's a super important topic, even for those folks that may be listening that are into natural medicine, that are maybe even practitioners, colleagues, etc. Um, there's some subtleties here that are important.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to conceptual, like we have belief systems, we use metaphors to describe the world and things, even in science, that we're often not consciously aware of. And one of the big ones is in medicine. And this really started in the middle of the 1800s, around the 1850s, with Rudolf Virchow, who was a physician in Vienna, in Austria. And basically, Virchow was the first to really put together evidence that was building at that time that the building block of life is the cell, and that disease starts in the cell. Before that, people believed in humors and all these other things that basically, if they were in the wrong combination, that would lead to disease. And those theories are very general and non-specific, and it led to really bad practices like bleeding people. And people often died from that, or using high doses of mercury, and et cetera. So all these different kinds of approaches grew out of those older ideas. So Virchow came around and he said, no, it's more subtle. The disease really begins in the cell. And ever since that time, we've looked more and more and more at the cell level and at the mechanisms at which the cells work. And we start to look at how we can interfere with those mechanisms. And that is the so-called pathogenic approach. We focus on disease and disease mechanisms, and we target them. And we can target some of them, as I mentioned before, very precisely. And that's the whole impulse of modern medicine. The entire healthcare system is set up around that. In fact, we really shouldn't call it healthcare. We should call it, disease care, because that's what we're really trying to do, is manage disease, target disease, and so forth. Now, the term salutogenesis, saluto means health, genesis means the origin of. This actually originated from Aaron Antonovsky, who was a medical sociologist, and in the 1970s, he sort of coined this term. He worked a lot with concentration camp survivors and whatnot, and he was wondering, what makes a person thrive, or other people, when they face adversity, they just collapse. They can't recover. And we see that in the clinic all the time. Some people get sick and then they bounce back. They have high resilience in this way. And others, the resilience is maybe compromised a bit. And so they suffer. They continue to have this illness that prolongs and so forth. And so he looked at what are the factors that generate health. And that's where he coined this term salutogenesis. And his work was really focused more on the psychological and the sociological. So, for example, having a community network around you, having good psychological coping mechanisms, all these different things he found would improve resilience. And so that's where his work focused on. Some researchers, and myself included, have looked more at this idea of looking at physiologic resilience and how do we strengthen the organs, the inner processes, life activities to resist disease. So it's not focusing on the disease, but it's focusing on the factors that restore your physiologic health. So physiologic salutogenesis, and this really begin, if you go down that avenue, you begin to look at how all the hormones interact, how your immune system is functioning, how your nervous system is functioning. So we have to look at what's called the neuroendocrine immune system and how all that ties together. So a salutogenic approach looks at the broader picture that historically people have referred to as the terrain of the body, the terrain of your organs, your liver function as a whole, your kidney function, your circulatory function, and uses different therapies. This is, again, Antonovsky was focused more on the psychological. Mm-hmm. Others have focused more on the physiologic. So I use therapies to try to work with the physiologic level to restore organ health and function through herbal medicines, nutrition, specific nutrients, micronutrients, that sort of thing. So the idea is we're really not interested. I mean, the disease is important. And that's where you have to, in the clinic, sort of decide, okay, do I need to focus into a pathogenic thinking? Do I need to just stop this inflammation? This person's in critical condition. We need to, that's where modern medicine really shines is, if you're in the emergency room, you want that kind of approach because that can be life-saving in that moment. You have a broken bone, or shattered bone, you want the orthopedic surgeon to go in with a pathogenic mentality, very mechanistic, to fix that thing, right? But then you got to go home and it's got to regenerate. It's got to heal. That's where the salutogenic approach is. How can we optimize that healing? How can we make sure that your body will regenerate in the right way it needs to? Does it have all the right building blocks? Does it have the right information to heal? And that's where we can apply a salutogenic approach. So this is how we can weave them together. And unfortunately, what people have done is they polarized so-called East and West, because salutogenic thinking tends to be more common in the Eastern traditions. So we say, and the Western is more the pathogenic. So we say East-West is really the salutogenic pathogenic divide. What's interesting about that is that most of China now is very much pathogenic in its thought processes and medicine and whatnot. So we can't even say it's Eastern anymore. It's, I don't like those words, East and West. They're not meaningful. But basically pathogenic, salutogenic, we can say that the whole healthcare system right now is focused on the pathogenic side. If you go to a doctor, the doctor will not be reimbursed for talking to you about how to support your organs and resilience. So you won't make any money. I mean, I'm not saying that's why we go into medicine, but you can't make a living, doing that sort of thing because it's not even on the radar screen for people. But I think in the future, because we're getting these very complex diseases that are multifactorial, there's not one cause anymore. There's environmental pollution, there's radiation, there's all these other issues that are compounding. And the salutogenic approach would say we don't have to worry about what all those factors are. What we know in this particular case is this person's liver function is really compromised. They're not metabolizing their hormones well. they're not generating different hormones to regulate insulin well, and these different things. So we can support that, and that has a global effect throughout the body. That will help you detoxify better. That will help you do all these different things. So we don't have to worry about all the downstream effects. We can look more globally this way. So that's how I generally think of the two in parallel.
Right. And another important concept in there, and you mentioned it already, is this idea of terrain. And in my research and my personal writings and whatnot, and my sort of my thesis work at the end of my education, I really wanted to track down this term terrain because just like terms like scientism and then this whole germ and terrain theory debate that's sort of poked its head up in recent years because of COVID. I really wanted to track down this idea of terrain. Where does it come from? Why is everyone using it? Oftentimes, people are uh, sort of sourcing the original use of the word terrain from the 19th century French histologist Claude Bernard. And in my research and writing, I found that he did indeed sort of begin to use this term, the milieu intérieur, this French concept for the internal environment. However, what's interesting here, and this is actually, we're seeing this nowadays too within sort of this kind of debate between the pathogenic and salutogenic medicines. Claude was actually an opponent of what we call, and you're aware of this term, but for the audience, of vitalism. At the time, there was still the idea of this vital force, and this is a concept for folks who are perhaps naturopaths themselves or involved in there, this idea of the vis medicatrix natura and this idea of this vital force that underlies the sort of the background of the terrain and is the sort of production of our health. But Claude, like I said, was an opponent of this. And nowadays, even within the natural medicines, they're still sort of leaving out this important aspects. And we might call that the vital force. We might call that many different terms in Eastern medicine for that. But I think even science, and I would argue sort of true science, following the actual scientific method in areas and fields of study such as biophotonics and within electromagnetic fields and even the work within what we're seeing with water nowadays. I think it's only time will tell and show that indeed there is some sort of force behind all of this, however we want to name it. But could you talk a little bit about that? Because that's also a key distinction when we talk about terrain or when we're approaching this. And, from what I've learned from you and from what my readings with Steiner and studying anthroposophy, this is a really foundational concept that I think if you went into a modern allopathic doctor's office, they would laugh us right out oftentimes. And even in the natural medicines now, where it's all nutraceuticals and data and genetics, this concept as well is sort of something to be laughed at. Could you talk a little bit about that?
That's a long discussion, but starting with Bernard, I mean,
Yeah,
Claude Bernard was the so-called father of modern
right,
physiology. And so a lot of the basic approaches we use in physiology started with Bernard's research. Bernard was interesting because he was at that time when scientists more and more were abandoning ideas like vitalism and whatnot.
right,
What's interesting is that he, of all of the materialists, we could say, was more broad-minded.
right.
He looked at the whole picture. Others like Karl Rokitansky was another who looked at the whole terrain, the whole overall health of the body, circulation. But Bernard actually took the word milieu interior, borrowed it from a colleague who had used it as a description for what was known in ancient Greece as the vis medicatrix naturae. So the vis medicatrix really got renamed as the milieu interior, and then later that was really morphed in the idea of homeostasis. So what we call homeostasis in physiology, or now homeodynamics, because it's constantly, the set points are constantly changing. That actually comes from ancient Greece. That same concept has gotten morphed into different terms. The difference is, Bernard was, again, like most scientists, like, what can I measure?
Mhm,
I can measure hormones, I can measure nerve activity and so forth. I can't measure the vital force. That's not measurable.
mhm,
And so, he, like many, were sort of opponents of it in the sense that, well, it's one of these ideas which doesn't help us explain anything. It's more just resorting to magic, saying, well, there's a vital force and it takes care of everything and we won't have to worry about it. But that was kind of opposite of what he was trying to do. What's interesting is that a lot of the arguments people used in the 19th century for vitalism have now gotten morphed into the gene. So we talk about intelligent genes or selfish genes, or we give genes all these purposes. Well, from a purely scientific perspective, a gene is essentially just a string of nucleotides, with phosphorus and a little sugar. And so basically, how can it have any of those qualities? We've essentially put all those things in the gene. People are saying, well, the gene is the basis of life and everything. It's the basis for a blueprint for proteins. But that's it. If you give me the gene of a certain species, I can't tell you exactly what that will look like just from the genome by itself. I'd have to have other data. So how the organs form, how they structure, that's not in the gene. We need the proteins that the gene codes for. But how they all fit together, when genes turn on and off, and so forth, that's all a great mystery still. We have little pieces figured out, but not the whole thing. But going back to the whole vitalism picture, so in the 19th century, it was really this idea of movement away. In fact, there was Helmholtz, who's another famous physiologist, physicist, worked out the laws of optics and hearing and these different things. He formed a club actually in Berlin with several others back in the, I think, 1830s, 1840s, that were basically, they signed this pact that said, we will always, basically in our research, emphasize a materialist explanation. Right. That vitalist explanations need to be put into the grave. And this is the time we need to end this. And so that's really where that's where we stand today. I mean, essentially, that's where modern medicine is today. Now, what we're finding, you alluded to different things. So, for example, going back to that, let's talk about an organ. And these ideas actually come from Michael Levin, who's a researcher at Tufts University. He's just fascinating, and I would definitely highly recommend you explore his work if you're interested in this. But, basic questions of how does an organ form? It's very interesting. Like the liver is an organ that you can actually, in an adult, cut out 2/3 of it, and it will completely grow back to its original form, and then it stops growing. It's kind of interesting. Like, how does it know? Like, the liver is made of all these millions of cells, and each cell has the same DNA in it. How does the DNA know? How does the cell know when to turn itself on and off, and so forth? And when we look at organisms like salamanders and whatnot, you can cut off limbs and whatnot, and they completely regenerate the limbs, the bones, the cartilage, the muscles, the nerves, the blood vessels. All of this has to regenerate, and then when the limb is formed, it stops. That's remarkable. Right. If we understood that process, we would understand how to re-engineer organs. We would understand how to, heal cancers and these different things. And, unfortunately, people talk about stem cells and whatnot, but that's, they throw stem cells in there and they maybe put a chemical cocktail and try to but that's not coming close to what the body does. It's far more complicated than this. And so Michael Levin, as I mentioned, actually has discovered that it's actually cells are, again, not these static little things we see in the textbooks, but they are, bags of organized, structured water, and their membranes actually hold electrical charges. This is called the resting membrane potential, and then in neurons, that potential is changing, and that's how nerve impulses pass through. We know all this in physiology. But what we didn't know up until recently was that resting membrane potential actually determines how the genes express and what that cell will become, basically. And by changing the electrical potential in the cells, we can actually form organs in different places. So he in his lab, they've been growing, like just changing the electrical potential in cells, not tinkering with the genes at all, able to grow an eyeball where a tail should normally grow, in a salamander or frog or whatever. And so it's very interesting how, we have the hardware of the body, the genes and all this different stuff, the cells, but we also have the programming, and the programming seems to come through that bioelectric code, as he's now calling it. And we can alter that bioelectric code. And I think that is a way that science is coming closer to what people historically talked about as the vital force. Now, the vital force is challenging, and thinkers like Rudolf Steiner argue, actually, it's an outdated concept, that because when we think about a force, we think about a force like electricity or magnetism or the strong and weak nuclear forces. Those are the known forces of physics. Um, we've searched hard for a vital force, a fifth force, and we haven't found one in this sense. Now, it doesn't say it doesn't exist, but using our usual ways of thinking about forces in space-time, we can't find it. Now, what Steiner argued is the reason we haven't found it is that actually it's not a force in the usual sense at all. It comes from a different dimension of space, really. It's working through time. And so what animates organisms is actually much more subtle. It's getting into activity seeping into the physical realm from a different space, basically. And this gets very abstract, but we can start to saying that there are, it brings us into that discussion to say that there are maybe supersensible worlds permeating this one, different dimensions of space and time that basically are seeping information through. And that's what we would perceive. That information maintains those electrical fields, those cell activities, and then that seeps into the genome, and that's how things work. So it opens up a whole new kind of science, but we're kind of at the cusp of that right now. We don't have a lot. We have a lot of theories, but not a lot of evidence. But people like Michael Levin there's a biomedical engineer, Gerald Pollack, University of Washington. Pollack has worked a lot with the electrical properties of the structured water within cells and how they basically regulate all your biochemistry in these different things. So, we often leave that water aspect out, but the water, when you put it in there, becomes very interesting, and it really brings a whole different dimension into living organisms. In fact, that's the basis of life, is water. But we have pretty much neglected it. We don't see it in the textbooks. I mean, yeah, you talk about it and you see it in kind of the pictures, but we see these pictures of proteins. We don't look at all the water that's structured around that protein, how it's holding charge, how it's really helping that protein fold in a different way and organizing its activity. So I think through that electrical activity, that would be one aspect, in the structured water, getting close to what the ancients refer to as the vital force. And it's really more akin to the way those charges are held within cells, the membranes and the structured water, is akin to a software program. So, right now, if you get a new software program, you don't go in and rewire your microprocessor, solder different connections. That's how they did it back in the 50s, 40s and 50s with the computers. If you had a new program, you had to literally rewire the way that the circuits fit together. Today, we just load it onto your operating system, and then it figures out what to do and uses the hardware in the right way. That's kind of how the body works, we're finding. A lot of what we've studied so far is the hardware. We've studied the genes and all the different molecules and the different parts. But how those parts fit together, what are the programs running those parts that are maybe working through the bioelectric code and maybe more subtle mechanisms, that's just now emerging. And I think we can get to a place where we can start to maybe reprogram the software of the body to regenerate organs. Or what Levin and others have sort of discovered is that the things like cancer are actually when cells decouple from the global electrical fields and they go rogue. They essentially are your own cells. That's why you can't really fight cancer, because they're your own cells. And they've really just become ostracized from the whole. And so the way to really treat it is to reintegrate them back into the whole, not to try to target and kill them. I mean, I'm not saying that that approach is not useful in some cases, but there's another more subtle approach that's emerging, which is arguing you got to reintegrate it back into the electrical environment of the body, back into, again, what the ancients might have called the vital force, and that essentially can help restore order again in the tissues. So kind of a longer explanation, but I think it's important because that vital force keeps coming up, but I think we're going to have to really rethink what we mean by it. Right. As Steiner argued, it's not a force like electricity or magnetism at all, although it maybe uses those forces. It's definitely coming from a higher dimensional space. For any physicists out there, it's actually closer to what, if you study electromagnetic theory, there's something called both the magnetic and electric potentials, vector potentials. These are theoretical tools we use in calculation, but they're not thought to be real. But some, like the physicist David Bohm, have argued they're actually real things. And they're changing the electrical and magnetic environments in a region of space. But where they come from is more subtle. It's almost like something is coming through that potential field. There's like a higher field, super field, that is coming from. So if there is a vital force, in my opinion, it's something along those lines. It's not like some force we just haven't measured yet. And we can't work with it. We can't measure it with our typical instruments. But this is where a healer, maybe with their subtle sensations, the human organism, can detect it. And that's where, the human sensory organs are the most powerful machine we have on that level. If you hone and refine them, you have to get into a different mental space. You can't be in your intellectual mind. You have to sink into these more subtle modes of consciousness. But when you're there, you can begin to experience different subtle phenomena on the body, different rhythms, subtle rhythms, flows, temperatures, sensations, these different things. And that can all give you sort of an emergent picture of how those, we might say, bioelectric fields, everything else is working more subtly.
Hmm. Absolutely. And this directly relates to the endeavoring for a scientific method, whereas maybe folks still think, well, we're using terms like vitalistic force, or we're using terms that are immeasurable. But when we talk about the ability of the human body and the senses, and looking at works like Steiner's Knowledge of the Higher Worlds, I think oftentimes people equate some of these extrasensory perceptions and these so-called woo-woo phenomena as they often equate that with sort of the New Age movement, where it is very such ungrounded and there doesn't seem to be a practice behind it. But I would argue, really, in a lot of Steiner's works and other folks similar, like in, for instance, Knowledge of Higher Worlds, there's a very clear, very methodical approach to developing these skills, honing these skills. And this is this kind of idea, and we can get into it a little more, of a spiritual science. And I think a lot of times, especially in those in the reductionistic kind of scientism mindset, often say, oh, this is woo-woo, this is crazy. Meanwhile, they're doing exactly what they often argue against, where they are leaving out a lot of data. They're oftentimes sort of only looking with one eye open at things, not using the other observable sensory information. And they're sort of leaving out a very important part of the scientific method, and that's sort of testing a hypothesis and allowing for the possibility of really anything to occur and to happen during that process of investigation. It's almost like they sort of have their blinders on and they're focused on one thing. So I just wanted to reiterate that for the listeners as well, in the sense that there truly is a methodical approach to all of this. And it gets a little muddied with kind of the new age phenomenon. And I think that leads us into, on the other end of the spectrum here, I think a thread that we've woven throughout this whole conversation is really one of balance, of the middle way. Steiner talks a lot about this in many different works. But we really need that, I think, nowadays, a balanced approach. How do we combine both of these methodologies and approaches to the world? And oftentimes, I think it might just be human nature. We tend to gravitate toward one side or the other because it sort of fits our way of viewing the world. And one of those ways of viewing the world, most likely as a response to the sort of reductionistic, sort of dry, black and white, zeros and ones, is the New Age movement. And applying that to the natural medicines. And one of those areas that I have concern in is a huge thing in naturopathic medicine right now, is the use of microdosing of psychedelics, and the use of these things that they often talk about. Well, we're sort of bringing back the pieces of ourselves that have been long forgotten or covered up because of scientism. And we can apply these same principles and be very careful and studious about stepping into, especially recognizing that there are indeed other forces at play here that might not be so visible. And Steiner talks a lot about this, goes into it in great detail. But there's some real concerns that I've seen working in my clinical practice with folks with the use of things like psychedelics that we might say open up other senses of our body that we may have perhaps have become forgotten or in a state of slumber. Can you talk a little bit about this? Because I know we've chatted a little bit about this before, but it is a concern just to completely go to one side of the extreme as sort of a response to, well, science and there is no spirit and there is no this and that and the other. So let's go really hardcore to the other extreme. That also poses a risk.
Yeah. I mean, it's an emerging trend for sure to use psychic substances or psychedelic substances to, in a way, sort of bypass some of the harder work, which
Right,
is,
right.
I think it's very true that we have what we might call dormant sensory organs. And I think this goes back to your descriptions of modern scientists. I think, good scientists that are really working with the phenomena for many, many years, um, I think, are using those higher senses and they get insights. A lot of the insights we have in science have, I think, come from, you might call, a spiritual place. In fact, this gets into a whole deeper question. Again, the modern viewpoint, which a lot of people don't question, is that we equate mind and brain. So basically, your mind is just coming from your brain activity. If we really look at it, a thought is interesting because a thought is not measurable, it's not weighable, we can't put it on a scale, it's not material. It's also, I mean, yes, we might say there's energies, nerve energies, electrical activity, but it's also, you can have electrical activity, but we don't say that those are thoughts necessarily. So thought is something that is not of the material world. It's not of the physical world. Same with an emotion. Emotions are not measurable. And especially if you kind of go into the dream world, if we say that's more emotional, we're in a world where the laws of the physical world break down. We can travel at an instant anywhere, we can float and fly and all these different things. Of course, the modern viewpoint is to say, well, that's all just, an illusion, it's a hallucination. They can point to different parts of the brain, different neurotransmitters, and so forth. But if we really hone, and people in different traditions and the Buddhist traditions and whatnot, for example, have really honed meditation skills to observe the dream world and even more subtle realms, the thought world, more subtly, and you begin to realize those are actual spaces, they're dimensions, they're places, not physical place. They're interweaving this place, this physical space, but that's like an inner dimension that you can, in your consciousness, move into. And I would argue that most people today are just tuned to view the physical world, and they can see parts of the physical world. Or they're tuned now more to their screens. And so they're seeing a very narrow kind of world this way. Interestingly, that world in the screens is a purely parallel universe of thoughts. It has little to do with what's going on out there in nature, which is very interesting. People are living in these worlds. We live in these inner spaces all the time. And yet the scientist says, oh, they're all illusions. They're basically just products of your matter, which is not how we experience it at all, And of course, the authorities say, well, that's how it is, well, that's what you believe. That's not necessarily true. So if there are these different spaces, we can develop organs to perceive them. We can realize that a lot of the things we talk about with depression and anxiety and these different so-called mental disorders are really phenomena of those more subtle spaces. Now, of course, they're linked to the physical body. We know that disorders in the physical body, imbalances in neurochemicals and imbalances in your organs and your gut can all influence that space, but that experience is something that is non-physical. Now, we can use different substances like psychedelics to immediately open those organs and peer into those worlds, peer into those spaces. But then when you're off that substance, maybe you have the memory of that. But then, the question is, well, how do I re-enter that space? How do I get back there? How do I gain insight from that space that is actually something that can guide my life? We can say that maybe what we call intuition is really accessing those information from those spaces. And we might talk then about intelligences in those spaces, beings that can influence us in different ways. And if you are of the Christian path, we'd say there's a Christ being and Christ consciousness that you can tap into. And that Christ consciousness can guide you in different ways, and you can let it flow into you. When you're on the psychedelic, maybe you have an experience of that or other beings. We can say that in that world, there maybe are not such good beings as well. There are beings that maybe consciousnesses that want to hinder you in a certain way. And as you mentioned, Rudolf Steiner discussed there's two polarities of those beings, what we might call the Luciferic beings and the Ahrimanic beings, or what people call the satanic beings, that actually Satan and Lucifer are not the same. They're two polar opposites. And that the sort of Christ path, Christ consciousness is to learn how to stand in the middle and to not get lost in either of those poles in a way. But that these poles, the things that pull us, drives, desires, and so forth, we can say originate from those beings, and that our job is to try to steer our way closely there. When you take a psychedelic, it's hard to differentiate what all those beings are. And especially if you don't know and don't have experience in that, you can be confronted now with these different, more subtle phenomena that you have no understanding of. And that can be terrifying for one. It can also lead to more downstream problems. But it also is sort of cheating the system in the sense that you haven't really done the work to get there.
Right.
You have to really prepare yourself, and people spend decades, lifetimes,
Right.
going through and preparing these inner activities so that when they approach that world, they understand what it means. Just like if you want to approach the physical world from a scientific perspective, you have to go through a lot of schooling to get there. You can't just, from sixth grader, be like, okay, start doing science in the lab now. Well, what do I do? And if you're brought into a lab and shown stuff, it wouldn't make any sense to you. You'd be like, what is all this? And you would miss a lot of what's there. And you might actually bring back the wrong ideas, the wrong impressions about that. Like, I saw the scientist doing this, but actually that was not related to the main science at all. That was some side thing. So I think that can happen when you're on psychedelics, is essentially you don't get a true grasp of what's there. And it's also not necessarily lasting. Now, I think there's potentially positive benefits too. And that's what a lot of the research is, some of the research at least, is reporting, that at the very least, they can break open a sense organ and say, hey, there's more to it than just the physical world. There is these whole different dimensions you can explore, and that are available and possible. And so, yeah, so this is, maybe that can be very revelatory for someone who has not really thought that and not really believed that. So I think that can have a positive benefit. But then afterwards, I think it's up to the individual to say, okay, well, let me start doing that inner work through meditation, through other activities, to really get back there, to be able to experience that world consciously through my own will activities, not something when you're on the psychedelic, it's like it just comes at you, like you don't know, you can't control it. You're not consciously sort of able to will it into existence or not. But I think a healthy approach would say, well, let's enter that world, but now through my own will, and be fully awake and aware, not drugged out, not have my consciousness suppressed, but set my ego aside and really try to be open and fully present and aware in that moment. And that takes a lot of inner work. That's not something you can just do on a weekend with a psychedelic.
Right, absolutely. And I think my observation clinically and consulting with others and, listening to friends and colleagues that, try this or trial it. One big aspect that I've seen is maybe someone partakes in the use of microdosing psychedelic substances. Then what I've observed is they're almost sort of, especially if they haven't gone through the preparatory means of practice to prepare for this, what I've seen is it's almost as if they're poking little holes in their etheric body. And so they're sort of in between worlds, we might say, throughout the day. And these people generally have higher levels of anxiety, and they generally have a bit more, especially if they haven't done the preparatory work, a bit more ungroundedness type of dis-ease processes, such as anxiety, to name one, but more mental, emotional instabilities and odd kind of symptomologies and things. From my observation, and I'm curious to hear yours, it's almost as if there's, like I said, poking little holes in the etheric body, and it's like there's this sort of leaking as well as when there's an opening, not only can things leak out, but that's a doorway, and other forces may find an easier entrance into that. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think what you're alluding to here is important to understand. I think, again, most people, when they think of the body, they think of the physical body, this
Right,
thing you can see and touch and measure. That's that thing that's on the in the cadaver lab that you can dissect.
right,
But as you're kind of alluding to here, we can argue that both traditional medicines, but increasingly even in modern research, we're beginning to see that if we start to think of the, for example, informational field working through the water and the electrical activities as a body, that is a second body that is not easy to pin down. You can't just pin it and study it. It's changing constantly. You'd have to have special imaging cameras to kind of capture it, and we're going to get there, I think.
right.
But we see that field is constantly changing, and that is what you're referring to as the etheric field, that informational body. We can argue that beyond that, there's even more subtle body made more of light, a subtle light, coming again from a different dimension that has, in the Western traditions, been referred to as the astral body. If you go to Chinese medicine, they refer to it as the Hun spirit. But basically, this body is the body that where our emotions reside. It's our emotional body in a certain sense. And it works through our organs, our blood, our nervous system. So it's integrated with all these different activities. And then we have a fourth body that has been discussed in the Western traditions that's related to, so we can say the light body is more our soul, our personality, and that sort of thing, versus a fourth body, which is directly related to our spirit, our core identity. And instead of light, it works through warmth. So we can say it's our warmth body. So we have a solid physical body, a fluidic body, the more etheric life activities, a soul, gas, light body, and then a warmth body permeating all this together. And people like Rudolf Steiner and others have argued that there's actually three additional bodies that will be developed in the far future, but are still dormant for most people. But those are the four that we can work with now. Now, what happens when you take a psychedelic? Well, from that perspective, if you can observe these bodies, and there are people that argue they can see these different things, that essentially the spirit body, your core identity, steps aside. It's pushed aside, especially out of different organs in the head, your pineal gland and elsewhere. And so you're left with a direct experience of the soul world. When we say the dream worlds and all the beings and entities, also your psychological baggage all comes to the surface very clearly now, because you've kind of, that we often are prevented from seeing that from the lower aspects of our spirit body. We call that part the ego. So we push that ego aside. Now we see all these different things, but they can come rushing at you. The warmth body, the spirit body, is normally there to also protect you from more subtle influences from getting in. So if you push it aside, as you argue, yes, you're more open now to attack in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
This can happen often also after a trauma. Your spirit body is stepped aside in a little way, and now these other forces can come into you, and they can remain there as memory patterns in a certain way, and they can play out their existence within you. On a physical level, I don't know enough to say, well, are there changes in those electrical activities in the cells? That would be the etheric level, holes in the etheric. Possibly, yeah, and different organs can certainly be affected, especially if you're using these kind of drugs on a regular basis. I think one experience for most people probably is not going to do that, but it has that potential. And with the kind of chronic use of marijuana and these different things, I mean, any substance, alcohol, cigarettes, whatever, can all do that as well. We clearly know alcohol is one of the worst killers, and so I'm not trying to pin the blame on marijuana or anything, but the more of these substances we use, the more potential there is, I think, for the spirit body and the protective nature of it to be set aside, and then other influences come in. I mean, the way we see that is kind of like in advertising when you have subliminal messages come into you.
Right.
It's coming in under your awareness, and now those messages play out in you, and then you're like buying that product at 3 a.m. like, why did I do that,
Right.
and it's kind of like that's what happens on a subtle level here. So I think if we understand that, okay, there are higher dimensional worlds and we have bodies in those worlds, we can start developing a higher dimensional anatomy and physiology, and we can start to ask questions like, well, when you take different substances, what happens, there? For example, when you drink coffee, it's interesting, it's discussed how it actually changes the relationship of your soul body and your spirit body around your head a little bit.
Mhm.
And it actually creates more intellectual thinking. So people that are coffee drinkers tend to be very good at intellectually, like a journalist, piecing things together, or a scientist, versus tea has a very different effect on the subtle bodies in this way. So you can start asking really interesting questions about how different nutrients, nutrition affects the relationship of these bodies to one another, and how it allows for different experiences.
Right, absolutely. Very interesting that you bring up the analogy of the subliminal messaging, because this leads perfectly into kind of a reasoning and a little quote I want to share from Steiner here on relates to perhaps one of the reasons why there's been a resurgence in some of these psychedelic uses and shamanic practices, especially in a culture and in a time period where it's almost void of spirit and void of these things. And again, I think it's very common for them, especially the modern human condition, to sort of go to one extreme or the other. Oftentimes, we're lacking this idea of balance and a middle approach in our world. And we just spoke of one of those extremes, and that was sort of the resurgence of the psychedelic use and shamanistic practices. But recently, I've been sort of experimenting and observing and studying in my sort of day-to-day clinical work with Strophanthus. And Strophanthus is an interesting, we'll call it an herb in this case, Strophanthus gratis or Strophanthus combe. I'm using it in a homeopathic dilution, you could say. And um, and it was interesting. I came across Steiner said that he likens Strophanthus as a remedy to neutralize the damaging effects of our culture. And I'm still sort of chewing on that one, thinking about that a lot. It's very interesting. But then that reminded me, and I wrote this quote down here to share. This relates perfectly with what we're talking about. This is from a lecture, The Spiritual Effects of the Physical Environment on Health. This is a 1908 lecture by Rudolf Steiner. And he says, when you walk through the streets of a city and are confronted with the atrocities on the billboards and in the shop windows, it exerts an appalling influence on your soul. Materialistic science has no idea how many seeds of illness there are in these abominations. They only look for the pathogens and the germs and do not know how health and disease are brought into the body by way of the soul. So, this quote here by Steiner really encompasses several areas that we've been talking about: terrain, idea of germ theory, idea of other modalities, or rather methods of we'll say, the development of disease in humans. Uh, and, it relates to what I said about the remedy Strophanthus, and I've seen this coming up for a lot of people uh, in the sense that there's so much damage and dis-ease created within us due to the effects of our modern culture. And that relates as well to this resurgence and all of these spiritual endeavors. Any thoughts come up for you there?
Yeah, so I think what Steiner said there is what we experience today and what everyone calls stress, right? So,
Yep.
so essentially, and of course, I think he's referring to a more subtle that we don't even realize the stressors that are coming into us. We think it's
Right.
our work and whatnot, but even watching television, looking at the fear mongering news, all these
Yeah.
different things, like these subtle impressions come into us. And with the COVID pandemic, you say that there was the germ itself, but then the fear around it, that was just contagious, and it really affected. And we know from physiology that essentially activates your so-called fight or flight nervous system. We say, how does the soul body fit into the life activities, well, it works through the autonomic nervous system, through the sympathetics, the fight or flight nervous system. So if you're constantly on sympathetic overdrive, you're in that fight or flight state, well, that shuts down a lot of activities. That shuts down your digestion. That can impact your circulation and your cardiac function, your heart function, that can raise your blood pressure, all these different things over time. So strophanthus is actually interesting. There's compounds in there that actually are, we have to be careful because, taken in normal doses, it can be toxic. They're cardiac glycosides, as we call them. And they're well known actually in Western medicine. They were used for many years. And we have different agents now. They have a very narrow therapeutic window, and that's why they're not used as much anymore. Similar to digitalis, which comes from foxglove. But strophanthin is the compound in there, but strophanthus, the plant, you can say its main effect is to actually relax the sympathetic nervous system and encourage the parasympathetic or rest and digest nervous system, especially in the cardiac area. So it's really a cardiac relaxant. And so for a lot of kind of modern humanity stressors, it affects the heart, it affects the circulatory system. In fact, diabetes and heart disease, diabetes really, I would argue, is we tend to think of it as a metabolic disorder. It's really a cardiovascular disorder. It really impacts the cardiovascular system, and especially type 2 diabetes, which is the most common one. So type 2 diabetes with insulin resistance, we know that's associated with increased risk for cardiovascular disease, high blood pressure, plaquing in the coronary arteries, et cetera. And strophanthin seems to be a universal remedy for that. Again, in very, very small dosages, and prepared in the right way and supervised in the right way. So I think it's very interesting how this is coming out now as a very important remedy for the heart. And it makes total sense from the perspective of, we can say the majority of damage to the cardiovascular system is, yeah, diet certainly plays a role. We talk about cholesterol and all these different things, but we now know that cholesterol itself is not adequate to explain, right, in and of itself, the formation of plaque and these different things. There have to be other factors. And one of those factors is continual activation of your fight or flight nervous system. And that, again, is being influenced by the environment around us, So all the things we're consciously, but also subconsciously processing, that all comes in through that autonomic nervous system. So, so I think strophanthus is a beautiful potential remedy here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then a little farther on the idea of plaque buildup, and I see that, and I've learned this from you as well. That's this sort of sclerotic tendency, and we see that as a base for many disease processes nowadays. What are your thoughts around how that maybe the overstimulation of the fight or flight nervous system, how that downstream produces this sort of solidifying sclerosis-like activity?
Yeah, I mean, we can study that from different levels. I think, backing out on a global level, we can argue that there are really two fundamental processes at work in physiology. One is the process that creates vitality, living tissue expansion. In fact, if you really look at acute inflammation, like when you get an injury and it heals, you get what's happening there is you get increased blood flow at first, then you get basically a breakdown of tissue, it liquefies, and then you get a rebuilding process that rebuilds all the tissues, that is full of life, full of vitality. So we say that's one activity of the body, more acute inflammation, but also just metabolic growth, living activity. Opposed to that, we have to have, if that went on by itself, you would just grow as a giant ball of cells. You would have no form. You would just be full of life and vitality, but you would have no consciousness, interestingly. You would just be constantly in a semi-sleep coma state. I mean, when you eat a big meal, that's how you feel after. You don't want to think, you just want to lay in the chair and like a turnip, I think turnips probably do a lot more than you do in the chair, but this idea of that we're constantly we have those life activities, but we need this formative activity. And Steiner was one of the first. He actually developed it. He took this idea from another 19th century physiologist, but the idea that the nerves actually provide the formative impulses to guide the structuring and formation of tissues. And especially in embryologic development, as we form our organs, we need the vitality met by a formative activity. And this activity arises from your nerves, both your sympathetic, but also parasympathetic, but also your central nervous system, all work with that. So, this formative nerve sensory activity meets the metabolic activity. And then Steiner argued there's a third, and that is a mediation activity through the respiratory and cardiovascular system. So your blood basically mediates the formative with the vitalizing activities. And interestingly, we can look at all of human disease as an imbalance of those three activities. In fact, the alchemists refer to those three activities as salt, the formative activity, sulfur, the metabolic activity, and then mercury, the rhythmical circulatory respiratory activity. So these are Paracelsus, for example, is a famous alchemist who discussed these three principles, Tria Principia. So basically, that was the whole formation of a lot of Western thinking about physiology up until Virchow in the 1800s, with the cell theory. So those three activities have to be balanced. I think what we're seeing in modern culture is the nerve sensory activity, like we said, both through the sympathetic, that's more unconscious stressors coming in, but also conscious stressors, your worries, your central nervous system activity. That exerts a constant hardening effect. It devitalizes you. In fact, that's why we sleep, Steiner argued, is that essentially we remove the soul spirit from the body during sleep. They go into a different realm, and then we can regenerate on the bed. Our body can regenerate itself. And we know that happens in the brain. For example, when you sleep, your neurons actually shrink, the spaces between the neurons actually open up, and you get this lymphatic fluid flowing through, cleansing everything out. So you basically clean house in your nerves, you regenerate tissues, you secrete, especially during what's called slow wave sleep. You secrete all these regenerative hormones like growth hormone and DHEA and these different things. So basically that's what when you repair. So your metabolic activities really take the forefront during night and sleep. And then during the day, you go back into your nerve sensory activities, and they have this hardening sclerotic kind of effect. And so diseases like atherosclerosis, but even Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, we can say that happens to the extreme when we actually find tangled and misfolded proteins accumulating both inside and outside your neurons. So we haven't been able to clean house. We've been too much in that nerve sensory mode. And of course, environmental factors like heavy metals, lead, and aluminum, these different things we know can really accelerate that process in high levels. So in a way, a lot of the modern diseases, and we can say that chronic inflammation is kind of key to a lot of these different things. What chronic inflammation really is, we often confuse, we just say inflammation, but we should really differentiate acute inflammation, which is that healing, potentially healing, life-giving activity. That's how you regenerate your tissue. So you go to the surgeon, you get things repaired, and then you actually have to go through an inflammation process after to clean house to get it all working again, and then things regenerate. But chronic inflammation is when you essentially get the healing with hardening going on at the same time. So you get both. The mediation between the two through the heart and the respiratory rhythms is not working properly. So you're getting essentially collagen depositing where it shouldn't. You get hardening, stiffening, you get plaque in your arteries, misfolded proteins in the brain. This is all chronic inflammation. And that's kind of the hallmark of a lot of modern illnesses. But we can argue it's really where we have not allowed the life activities, those vital metabolizing activities, to really do their thing. In fact, they work through warmth, they work through fever, they work through acute inflammation, and we're so scared of fever and acute inflammation. We always try to get rid of it. So you call the doctor, they don't do this as much anymore. They shouldn't, because we now have good data saying you shouldn't do it. But like kids, they get a little fever, mild fever, 100, maybe 101. They're like, oh, take Tylenol, take something to get the fever down. Well, the fever is probably doing a good thing, up to a point, right? And so, you have to sort of let it do its process. But the more you you suppress that warmth activity, that fever, inflammation, acute inflammation, the more tendency then, theoretically, this hypothesis that later you're going to have problems with more of these hardening chronic inflammatory issues. And I've seen this in acupuncture where you have chronic, knee pain or chronic shoulder pain. You give a treatment, it might flare
Right.
for a couple of days. That's the acute inflammation coming in, and then you get better. So interestingly, to treat chronic inflammation, you have to induce acute inflammation. And that's where sticking needles in there or using red light therapy, or now they're doing all sorts of prolotherapy. I mean, I think all those things are just doing the same thing. They're really just inducing local acute inflammation, which can bring healing forces into those areas.
Right. And I'm really grateful today for the synchronicities because this brings up just absolutely perfectly into, I think, a good summary and to tie a bow around really all the topics we've discussed today, and very important ones that I'm grateful for you introducing to my audience because this has been so foundational and crucial to my deeper understanding of medicine, of health, of life, and all that. And what I'm alluding to here is one final example of, again, the sort of reductionistic pathogenic approach to natural medicine nowadays. And that's a term that you had just brought up, and that's chronic inflammation. And why that term is so important is because nowadays, natural medicine, folks that, practice that, for lack of a better term, but still practicing it from a pathogenic sort of reductionistic model says, oh, they kind of find their niche, they kind of find their terms that they like to use, and one of those is all disease is just chronic inflammation. And kind of like you said, yes and no, that has to be farther distinguished. But really, what's hot right now within the natural medical modalities is every single disease process is inflammation. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to just throw anti-inflammatories at it. And oh, we definitely don't use those NSAIDs or, the toxic drugs and whatnot, as they say. But we're going to apply the same exact principles. And that's, a lot of people see, an herb that is really, I think, misunderstood in the natural medical communities, and one that I've kind of almost come to despise because it's so overused, and that's turmeric. And I think this will be a good example for you to go into. But turmeric, again, everybody's applying and throwing so much turmeric at everybody. It's just a pain, inflammation, all of this. It's just turmeric, turmeric, turmeric. And oftentimes, there are good clinical results with folks. But again, the important piece here, and I'll let you dive a little deeper into this, is one, the methodology, the way of knowing we come to utilizing that herb. And two, the reductionistic thinking of just if A, use B to treat. And we're really missing a lot when we practice that. So if you could, talk a little bit about turmeric from your perspective. You've kind of led up to it brilliantly with the idea of the warmth factors, and because turmeric in Chinese medicine, as you know, is a warming herb. My concern with the overuse of it as well, and then I'll finish my rambling here, is that in Chinese medicine, and we could argue Chinese medicine from an herbological standpoint within the Materia Medica and the way that the ancient Chinese approach herbal medicine it is a lot more salutogenic, a lot more humoral in the sense that we apply concepts to herbs such as the channels they enter, the energetic factors they have. Is it hot? Is it cold? Does it dry, damp? Those kind of things versus just this is anti-inflammatory because it contains the curcuminoids, et cetera, et cetera. So if you could expound a little bit upon that.
Yeah, that's a crucial topic because
Right,
I think what we've seen is that a lot of pathogenic materialist thinking has now filtered into the traditional medicines, and a lot of practitioners are thinking from that perspective. So, of course, you have inflammation, and we literally, people think in images, metaphors, and they think of inflammation as fire. Let's put out the fire,
right,
and you'll be better. I think there's a lot of things we have to think about. Well, a lot of times you need the fire to burn away all the garbage, right? And if you put out that fire, now you have just a bunch of ashes and garbage laying around.
yeah,
And that's again like a fever that doesn't do its work. It doesn't really clear out. a lot of the pathogens, doesn't really activate the immune system in the right way if you intervene too early. So so we have to think of it that there's a more complex metaphor, first of all. So what do we want? Again, when we talk about inflammation, we have to differentiate acute from chronic. And what we really want, we really need to see that is, again, an imbalance between those formative forces coming from the neurosensory system, the metabolic forces coming from your vital organs, and it's the circulatory system that regulates that. And the circulatory system works through your blood vessels and especially capillaries in the periphery. And what we now know in chronic inflammation, whether it be in the brain or elsewhere, is that we get something called endothelial dysfunction. That's really where the cells that line the capillaries, so capillaries are just one cell thick little vessels. Those cells lining, they're called endothelium. They normally should be able to relax and dilate when blood needs to go through to let nutrients and red blood cells and white blood cells come into an area. They need to be pliable, bendable, flexible, and they work through that. There's different mechanisms. For example, there's a gas called nitric oxide that they make to help them relax and so forth. And what we now know with chronic inflammation is that we have endothelium that doesn't relax. It stays stiff. And so we don't get the right nutrients, the blood flow and whatnot into an area to heal it. And so an interesting new strategy is, well, can we relax the endothelium? Can we get more blood flow going in there? And interestingly, that's exactly what turmeric does. So turmeric doesn't put out the fire. It actually gets more blood flow going into that area. So I think a lot of practitioners are using the wrong metaphor to understand it, first of all. Now, what's interesting about that is there are actually many other herbs that do that. And some people use them. For example, frankincense, boswellia is another herb that's excellent at doing that. In Chinese medicine, there's a whole category of herbs called blood movers, which all help support endothelium. So Chinese red sage, for example, is another thing there. So all of these things can be used in chronic inflammation to get more blood flow into an area. And that allows the body, the salutogenic activities, to heal themselves, to do what they need to do. So I think turmeric, interestingly, can be used salutogenically, but we just have to, we're talking about it the wrong way. And I think we need to then think more broadly and say, what else can we do besides just turmeric? And then you can start to think about how different herbs actually encourage blood flow into different organs in different areas of the body. And then you get more specific in your herbal prescribing. I see a lot of my naturopathic colleagues are not quite there in terms of differentiating. That's like everyone gets turmeric, as you say, or maybe the frankincense. But there's, a lot more to it than that. Yeah.
Right. And taking into account another important aspect of this, and Chinese medicine kind of helps us get there in the sense from the herbs, with the blood movers. We talked about this, we entered into this conversation with too much of one force, and that was this sort of sclerotic force from, the images in our culture and stress and all, it's all of this one force, one force, too much of such force causing a disease process in the body. Well, I think we forget that we can, just because we're using natural substances, we can also flip that and say, well, if we continually use blood movers all the time, if there's always movement and no stillness, well, that's a case to be looked at as well. So can you talk a little bit as we begin to wrap up here, some of the concerns there of, that pathogenic thinking, what we just talked about and discussed of, well, I'll give that as an anti-inflammatory. Oh, and now it's good to know, it helps, maybe somebody's listening to this and like, well, it's good to know that it's bringing some warmth force there and some movement, and that fits into this kind of salutogenic process. But then folks are on that for a long, 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 long time. And if there's too much movement and there's too much of one input over time, that starts to adjust the homeostasis or the balance forces in the body.
Yeah, let me go back a little earlier. You talk about Chinese medicine and the patterns. In Chinese medicine, we don't really think about diseases. We talk about patterns,
Right.
blood stasis, liver, qi stagnation, spleen deficiency. These are the more metaphorical terms. I think what that's really describing is what you referred to earlier as the etheric body. So those patterns in the electrical fields and whatnot that maintain your organs, I think traditional medicines like Chinese medicine, that's what they were perceiving, and that's what they were treating. as
Right.
opposed to the physical thinking, which is we got to bind to this receptor, we stop this mechanism, inflammation, whatnot. So they both can complement one another. But I think when you start to look at those patterns, you see that whenever you give the same herb, the same therapy, the body becomes unresponsive to it,
Right.
essentially adapts to it. It no longer has the same effect. It's also very, it's non-specific. Turmeric is better for getting circulation into certain parts of the body, not all parts. And so there are other approaches. Some people with chronic inflammation have real deficiencies in some of their adrenal steroids, DHEA, for example, one of them. And especially if they've been on steroid therapy, that can suppress their DHEA even further. And so there are different herbs that would then encourage that process. In others, it might be a real sluggish, again, liver metabolism where they have a buildup of hormones, but also other metabolites. So that's what the source of the inflammation is. So you need to work with the liver metabolism to kind of to improve that. So this is just all part of, I think, what you learn, maybe not in those same terms as an herbalist or someone who really works in that realm. And that's why being an herbalist, I think, is far more challenging than working with pharmacology. I use both. I don't like to use pharmacologic therapies, but as a I've been a primary care physician for many years in Oregon, for example. Naturopaths are licensed primary care physicians. And so I have to use those therapies. And again, there's a role for them in certain infections and different things. If you're having a rheumatic flare up, then probably going to give you the steroid therapy to get the inflammation to come down so we don't damage your joints permanently. So there's a role for all of those medicines, but at the same time, using the herbal therapies, I think you have to do a lot more thinking about, you have to really look more deeply at a person's physiology to understand what's going on. It's not as easy at all. And that's why I think a lot of people abandon herbal therapies
Mm.
as practitioners, because it's much more challenging. It's easy just to give everyone turmeric, but to say, well, do I need to use, the Chinese salvia in this case? Do I need to use Carthamus in this case? Do I need to, and that's a lot more difficult. And even just thinking in terms of patterns, like, we tend to think, oh, you come with a migraine headache. Well, what are the herbs for migraine? And I would argue there are no such herbs, but there are herbs that maybe support the person with a migraine with a liver issue, a person with a migraine with an adrenal HPA axis issue. There are herbs that address person with a migraine with GI issues. They're all different. So you have to go in and now differentiate, find sub patterns. And part of what I'm working with now is, or hope to work with, is be able to use actually machine learning to take data we gather currently and to find patterns in your physiology to say that not everyone with high blood pressure needs the same medicine. We have subgroups. And right now it's based on the doctor's intuition largely as to which medicines you get, maybe trial and error, but could we develop more accurate tests for that? But I think the same thing we're going to see with inflammation. It's chronic inflammation. It's not one size fits all. There are many, many subtypes. There's the circulatory problem subtype, there's the adrenal subtype, all these different things. And so you have to treat them differently. So I think that supports what you were just saying.
Absolutely. Well, as we finish up here and come to a close, I think I'd like to finish with the last question of kind of what does the future look like for you in terms of the broader landscape of our society, the world, health, medicine, all the topics we've really covered today. What comes to mind for you as we look into the future? A lot of people talk, especially in the kind of the communities and study that I'm involved in. There's Steiner talked about the war of all against all. There's definitely some interesting things going on in the world now. This is some of the reasons why I got into what I do. But then also, we've talked about some positive aspects today as well. What's it look like for you in the future?
Well, I think, you have to differentiate the immediate future. In other words, the next
Right.
50 years versus the next several thousand years. I mean, I think my overall outlook is positive. I think we're going to reach higher and higher states of awareness and inner development. I think as we become more cognizant of our more inner subtle processes, we're going to awaken these so-called spiritual organs, these organs that allow us to see into the subtle worlds more and more. And we'll be able to bring ideas more and more into how we can heal the planet, how we can improve medicine, these different things. I think right now it's going to be challenging for the next couple decades because we are really seeing a lot of older ideas breaking down. We're seeing, medicine is in a crisis stage. It's becoming so expensive. It's becoming so difficult for modern medicine to practice that I don't see how it's going to keep going without some sort of catastrophic failure unless we start making some major changes. And my own perspective is it's yes, we can do administrative changes, we can do policy changes, infrastructure changes, we can make healthcare more accessible to others. Again, when we say healthcare, we mean can you go to the doctor to get your drugs, basically. I mean, and also diagnosis and imaging and so-called right. Preventative care, yep. Immunizations and whatnot. But at the same time, I think we're going to have to really change the way we do science, and that's why I'm doing my own career track, postdoctoral fellowship. I feel like I've stood outside the conventional research realm for many years, decades, and have developed ideas and theories. But I think until you get in there, you're actually working in that field, you can start to maybe transform it from within. And, the people I've talked to, especially the younger ones, younger PhDs and whatnot, are mostly open to different approaches. They may don't understand them or don't really know why you'd use them. A lot of them don't have the perspective of having been in clinical practice to kind of bring into that. But I think there's at least a growing understanding that the way we're doing things is not really working out. We have exceptions to that, but I'm just looking at in my own particular field in bioinformatics. I mean, there's a lot of interest in more and more getting into the genome even more, and we pretty clearly now know that the answers are not all in the genes. It's the global phenomena like the electrical phenomena and so forth in the body that I think takes precedent over the genes. If we look at pharmacology, there's more and more interest in targeting specific receptors and more of these drugs coming out that are $15,000 a month. Well, that's great that you can do that, but number one, who's going to afford it? But number two, you tweak this one thing, the body's a complex system, you're going to have problems over here now that we don't anticipate till much later. And then we say, oh, okay, well, we'll abandon that one. Let's go. But this is how it keeps going. So I think we need to fundamentally change the way we do science, especially in medicine, how we think about the body as a network and a system. Whole systems biology is the new term for that. There is an interest at the NIH, for example, in salutogenic research, interestingly. So they're putting grant money towards projects that work in that direction. So I think there are some positive changes coming there. But I don't see that as happening across all of medicine. Those are little pockets of change. I think, the system will carry on until it basically can't anymore, and we're kind of seeing it rupture. I mean, already there are a large percent of Americans that have no access to healthcare because they just can't afford it. They're outside the system, and that's going to grow, unfortunately. And, the healthcare we're getting is often very suboptimal. Especially when it's all disease care focused. It's not, we're not able to do the other things. So something's going to have to change there. So in the short term, I see a lot of turmoil, a lot of things coming to the surface. I think long term, we'll get through it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Like you've mentioned throughout, you and currently a postdoctoral fellowship with bioinformatics. So a lot of we've been a student for a long time myself, so understand all the studying, all the work that goes into that. So again, I appreciate you for your time, very valuable. And I hope this was a good introduction, audience. I hope this was a great introduction to Dr. Kalnin's approach, his thought process, his studies, all of that, because it surely was for me, especially again, going back to the start of our conversation, the first time that I was exposed to this information, and very privileged to have had Dr. Kalnins as an instructor throughout that. Really changed my approach, Dr. Kalnins, to medicine, to study, opened me up to Steiner's work, to the really important concept of salutogenesis and terrain. And that's absolutely foundational in my sort of outside of the podcast world and my clinical day-to-day practice. That's absolutely foundational, and still a young fledgling practitioner in that sense, and just learning so much each time we speak. So again, thanks so much. As we close here, again, I'll include the links to Dr. Kalnin's YouTube and website below. Dr. Kalnins, do you want to plug anything else as we finish up here, or just give a resource or anything on here for anyone if they have want to learn more about what you do, or maybe want to see you for some telemedicine?
Nothing specific. I
Uh,
mean, if I do have online telemedicine practice, telehealth practice, you can access through my website. But I think, there are not so much on my website, but I know through the YouTube channel I've created, there's a lot of reading and other resources people can find there about these topics. So that could be another approach.
Absolutely. And I encourage folks that are listening or watching, definitely check out Dr. Cownan's YouTube channel for more. This is so much material to get into, and I hope, Dr. Cownans, that you'd be open to coming back in the future for a continuing guest, because I think there's really so much to cover. Again, this was an introduction to all this, but a lot of really important concepts, and I appreciate your approach and perspective on it all. So again, thank you so much, and appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Really enjoyed the conversation, and thanks for all the thoughtful questions.